April 13th, 1946. Langley Field, Virginia. The world is still shaking off the dust of World War II. Airfields once filled with bombers now hum with experiments, new fuels, new wings, new ideas. But on this morning, the horizon itself looks dangerous. A thunderstorm is forming over the Chesapeake, black and boiling, the kind that pilots are trained to fear. The tower operator peers through rain-streaked glass and sees something insane. A silver P-51 Mustang rolling down the runway into the storm. The voice crackles over the radio. Langley Control, NACA Test Flight 242 commencing turbulence entry. The operator freezes. Negative, NACA 242, abort takeoff. Repeat, abort. No response. The plane lifts, climbing hard into the black. Lightning flashes against the clouds, reflecting off its polished skin. The men in the tower can't believe it. No pilot would ever fly into that wall of weather, not voluntarily. But the man in that cockpit isn't just a pilot. He's a test pilot. His name is Robert A. Bob Champine, age 29. Former Navy fighter ace, now a civilian engineer with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the quiet government bureau that would one day become NASA. He's not chasing glory or breaking records. He's chasing data. Inside the cockpit, his world is a violent blur. Rain pounds like bullets on the canopy. The horizon vanishes. The altimeter needle jerks wildly as the aircraft is tossed by invisible hands. Static fills his headset. Every few seconds, lightning flashes. A white explosion that blinds him. His instruments flutter and reset. The artificial horizon flips upside down. He steadies the stick, throttles up to 2,800 RPM, and watches the numbers on his dashboard flicker. The readings matter more than his heartbeat. He mutters into the recorder, entering cumulonimbus layer, indicated airspeed 220, manifold pressure steady. The plane jolts. His head slams against the canopy. The seat harness cuts into his shoulder. But the engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650, keeps running. That's why he's here. For years, pilots had feared storms more than enemy fighters. In heavy rain or rapid icing, engines stalled, props froze, or cylinders drowned in water vapor. Hundreds of airmen had died not from combat, but from clouds. NACA's engineers believed they could fix it, if they knew what was really happening inside those storms. But the military refused to test it. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. So Champine volunteered. "If you want to know what kills airplanes," he'd said, "you have to go meet it in person." He wasn't exaggerating. The conditions inside a thunderstorm are violent enough to shatter wings. Wind shear can flip a bomber upside down. Lightning can jump through instruments. Rain can flood carburetors. It was suicide. And yet here he was, flying straight into it. Alone, unarmed, unaccompanied. With 152 instruments recording every second of the chaos. The aircraft bucked like a bronco, his seat harness strained. The windshield fogged. The oxygen system crackled. But the Merlin engine, that temperamental beast that had carried Mustangs over Berlin, refused to quit. That was the point. If it could keep running here, it could run anywhere. Outside, lightning turned the sky into daylight for half a heartbeat, and in that flash, Champine saw something most pilots never saw up close, the shape of a living storm, a spinning cathedral of vapor and death. He smiled through gritted teeth. "Still holding," he said into the mic. From the ground, Langley's tower heard nothing but static. Then, faintly, "Still recording. She's holding together." Minutes later, the radar blip disappeared. Everyone in the control room thought he was dead. But 28 minutes later, a voice came through the static again. Calm, precise, alive. "Langley, this is NACA 242. Data record complete. Request landing clearance." He'd survived. The storm hadn't killed him. The engine hadn't stalled. He had flown straight into chaos and brought back the math. That flight would become legend inside NACA, the day a pilot proved that science could conquer fear, that a man could face nature itself and come back with data instead of death. For the men on the ground, he was crazy. For aviation, he was the reason storms became survivable. And for Bob Champine, it was just another day at the office. Through the long years of World War II, one explanation haunted every crash report that didn't involve bullets: pilot error. It was an easy verdict and a comforting one. If pilots simply panicked, the machines could stay blameless. The manuals stayed unedited. The engineers stayed secure. But that was a lie written in blood. The truth, buried in thousands of flight logs, was far colder. The machines were failing their pilots. In the skies over Europe and the Pacific, Allied aircraft didn't always fall because they were shot down. They often fell because their engines quit, without warning, without logic, and without mercy. It happened at high altitudes, in storms, or even in clear skies. The propeller would slow, the manifold pressure would drop, and a few seconds later the engine would cough itself into silence. Pilots called it the whisper before death. Commanders called it inexperience. The factories called it a mystery. The data said otherwise. At NACA, the quiet team of engineers and test pilots studying wartime losses began to see a pattern. Engines weren't failing because of fear. They were failing because of airflow. The problem was invisible, the thin layer of chaos that forms where air meets metal. Engineers called it boundary layer separation. In certain flight conditions, heavy rain, turbulence, or ice buildup, airflow over carburetor intakes became uneven. The fuel-air mixture went wrong. Cylinders flooded. The engine stalled. On the ground, these conditions could be simulated, but the simulations never matched real flight. No wind tunnel could recreate a thunderstorm. That's why NACA needed pilots like Bob Champine, men who could fly not for glory, but for data, who would go where math failed to find the truth hidden inside terror. Champine had watched too many pilots die during the war to accept the official story. As a Navy combat veteran, he'd seen Corsairs and Hellcats fall from the sky for no reason. Pilots blamed themselves until the end. But he knew the truth wasn't in the cockpit, it was in the carburetor. After the war, NACA began investigating these unexplained losses. One test after another, in controlled weather, couldn't replicate the conditions. The data was clean, perfect, and meaningless. So Champine proposed something insane: fly into the mess. He said it plainly in a 1946 meeting. If the atmosphere kills airplanes, we should ask it how. His colleagues laughed nervously. The director called it unnecessary heroics. But the chief engineer, John Stack, one of NACA's most brilliant aerodynamicists, said nothing. Later, he walked up to Champine and handed him a flight order marked experimental. That's how it began. Not with orders, but with permission to break them. The myth that pilots panic had lasted because no one dared to prove otherwise. The manuals told aviators never to fly near thunderstorms, never to exceed structural limits, never to experiment in weather. Champine planned to violate all three. But he wasn't reckless. He was methodical. He redesigned his P-51D's carburetor system to record airflow and fuel pressure under stress. He mounted temperature sensors along the intake manifold, wrapped the wing leading edges in foil thermocouples, and wired an experimental recorder to log readings on magnetic film, 152 data points every second. It was the most complex instrument package ever flown in a piston aircraft. He told his ground crew, "We'll get the truth, or we'll get a funeral." No one knew what to say. To the untrained eye, his plan looked suicidal. But to an engineer, it was the only way to bridge the gap between theory and reality. Champine understood that fear didn't cause stalls. Physics did. And physics didn't care about orders. That was his quiet rebellion. He refused to let superstition and procedure decide what men could or couldn't learn. While others saw clouds, he saw equations. The storm wasn't his enemy. It was his classroom. He'd proved that engine stalls weren't about nerves, but about nature. That when a plane failed, it wasn't because a pilot lost his cool, but because engineers hadn't yet faced what he was willing to fly through. He didn't know if he'd survive. But if he did, no pilot would ever again be blamed for dying in a storm he didn't understand. And that made the risk worth it. Because in aviation, progress always begins with one man deciding that the manuals are wrong. World War II was a laboratory disguised as a bloodbath. Beneath the battles and propaganda, a secret war raged, not between armies, but between engines and air. Every nation's survival depended on its ability to make machines that could fly higher, faster, longer. But in the 1940s, no one really understood how air behaved at speed. The equations were half theory, half faith. For the Americans, victory in the air had come at a brutal price, and much of that price wasn't paid in combat. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces lost over 12,000 aircraft to mechanical failure. That's more than twice the number lost to enemy fighters. For every P-51 Mustang shot down over Europe, another was lost somewhere over Kansas, Texas, or the English Channel, to icing, flameouts, or sudden stalls. It wasn't cowardice. It was physics untested. Pilots called it the ghost in the throttle. The enemy you couldn't see, only hear for half a second before everything went silent. During the war, engineers were too busy producing machines to study their flaws. Quantity was victory. If one plane crashed, a dozen more rolled off the line. But after VJ Day, the mood changed. The production lines went quiet. The rush for new technology, jets, rockets, supersonic flight, demanded something the wartime factories had ignored: understanding. That's where NACA came in. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics had existed since 1915, a quiet government think tank tucked into the swamps of Virginia. During the war, they'd helped design wings, propellers, and airfoils for every major Allied aircraft. Now they were tasked with something even harder: making flight safe. To the public, NACA was invisible. But to the pilots who risked their lives every day, it was the difference between science and superstition. That's why when post-war accident reports began piling up, fighters falling out of clouds, engines dying mid-flight, NACA knew the solution wasn't discipline, it was data, and they knew only one man would volunteer to get it. Robert A. Champine wasn't just another test pilot. He was a bridge between two worlds: the disciplined courage of wartime aviators and the analytical precision of engineers. He'd flown F-6F Hellcats in the Pacific, earning a reputation for coolness under pressure. After the war, instead of chasing fame, he joined NACA as a research pilot. He traded combat missions for clipboards. His colleagues joked that he was the only man who reads the equations before he risks his life. Champine was fascinated by airflow, how something invisible could kill or save you depending on the angle. He'd seen the way weather could destroy a squadron, how a wall of clouds could turn confident men into statistics. He began to suspect that the real frontier of flight wasn't speed, it was stability. He studied hundreds of post-war crash reports. The same phrases appeared again and again: engine failure, power loss, fuel starvation, stall unwreck. It was a pattern hidden in plain sight. When the war ended, thousands of aircraft were sold as surplus to civilian pilots. Within months, the same deadly failures started killing farmers, mail flyers, and bush pilots. One crash in particular haunted him: a P-51 ferry pilot in Georgia who radioed, "Entering light rain, engine roughness," and vanished minutes later. The wreckage showed no bullet holes, no fuel leak. The carburetor was clogged with ice. That's when Champine realized the war's most dangerous enemy hadn't been defeated. It was weather. At NACA, engineers knew the solution would require real data: airflow readings, temperature gradients, fuel pressure variations, collected inside actual storms. No laboratory could reproduce those conditions. No wind tunnel could mimic turbulence or liquid water ingestion. That meant only one thing. Someone had to fly into the storm and record it by hand. Champine volunteered instantly. His superiors hesitated. One called it reckless. Another said, "We can't risk a national hero on a suicide experiment." Champine replied, "Then don't call it suicide. Call it calibration." He knew exactly what was at stake. The post-war aviation boom was coming. New airliners, private planes, experimental jets. If they couldn't solve the mystery of stall and icing, thousands more would die in peacetime skies. This wasn't a daredevil stunt. It was a race against ignorance. He told a friend over coffee at Langley's cafeteria, "In combat, we fought men. Now we're fighting physics. I think I prefer the men." That sentence summed up the quiet war that began after the big one ended. A war fought not with bombs, but with equations, courage, and weather maps. The world thought peace meant safety. For test pilots like Champine, peace just meant the experiments got lonelier. And somewhere above Virginia, a new kind of storm was waiting. One that would test whether courage and mathematics could coexist in the same cockpit. Because in 1946, the only way to make flying safe was to risk dying for science. The calm precision of post-war aviation statistics concealed a brutal truth. The war hadn't ended for test pilots. It had only changed shape. The enemy now was failure itself, measured in graphs instead of gunfire. By 1946, the United States Army Air Forces and NACA jointly tracked every flight incident on American soil. Their conclusion was chilling. One test aircraft was destroyed every 4 days. And most of those losses weren't combat veterans or reckless stunts. They were test flights. Controlled, scientific, approved. Planes fell from the sky while measuring how not to fall. The numbers read like epitaphs written in engineering shorthand. Altitude, 10,300 feet. Weather, icing, turbulence moderate. Cause, power loss, probable carburetor failure. Outcome, fatal. The recurring pattern was the same. Engine stall in turbulent air. For piston engines of the era, especially the Merlin and Pratt & Whitney series, air-fuel mixtures were everything. Too rich, and the engine drowned. Too lean, and it detonated itself apart. But storms, humidity, and sudden temperature shifts created chaos that no lab model could replicate. Rain could literally choke the engine, droplets slamming into intake manifolds, disrupting airflow, and cooling carburetor throats below freezing even at 70-degree ambient temperature. That's why NACA's engineers started calling it the invisible ice. It didn't form on wings where pilots could see it. It formed inside the heart of the machine. Pilots never had a warning light. One moment, full power. The next, silence. In Europe, that silence had cost lives. Bomber pilots described it vividly. Flying through storms at 20,000 feet, engines suddenly sputtering, propellers windmilling uselessly. Crews called it the death roll. In the Pacific, carrier pilots died within sight of home. Engines cutting out on final approach after long missions through tropical squalls. When engineers examined wrecks, they found the same residue. Moisture in carburetor throats, frozen venturas, clogged intakes. It was a mechanical disease, and no one dared to fly inside the storm long enough to study it. Except Bob Champine. He studied the math of the failures, tracing each accident backward like a detective following clues through wreckage. He discovered that in severe turbulence, engine pressure ratios fluctuated as much as 25% within seconds, far beyond what the carburetor could stabilize. Every bounce of the propeller's RPM changed fuel flow. Every shock wave twisted the intake pattern. The result, unstable combustion, what pilots called rough running. But rough didn't describe it. It was organized chaos. If the oscillation lasted too long, cylinders overheated and cracked. If the pilot throttled back to compensate, the sudden cooling froze the carburetor. No pilot could save the engine because no one knew what was happening inside. The physics were ruthless. Rain ingestion reduced available thrust by up to 15%. Icing could form in seconds, even in warm air. Lightning-induced electrical surges could spike magneto-voltage by 1,000 volts, frying the ignition coils. And in an era before radar and satellite forecasting, every storm was a mystery waiting to kill someone. That's why Champine's idea to fly directly into a storm wasn't madness. It was the only logical experiment left. NACA's lab data meant nothing without context. The war had proven that real weather was a different universe. To design engines that could survive it, they needed a map, one written in turbulence, not ink. So Champine began designing his flight plan like a soldier drawing up an assault on an invisible enemy. He picked his test aircraft, a P-51 Mustang, serial 44-84973, retrofitted with sensors and recorders. He selected a storm system forming over the Chesapeake, a humid, electrically charged cell climbing 20,000 feet. And then he did what no pilot had ever done deliberately. He requested clearance to fly into it. Langley's tower refused. The weather officers warned him, "You'll lose control. You'll lose the wings." His colleagues begged him to wait for a smaller storm. Champine just smiled. Smaller storms don't give you full data. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical. He had calculated the tolerances of his airframe, the stall margin of the Merlin, even the probable G-loads of the turbulence. The math said survival was possible, but not guaranteed. He logged it in his notes. Estimated structural limit, 8.2 G. Probability of exceedance, 35%. Probability of carburetor stall, 78%. Probability of pilot panic, 0%. It wasn't bravado. It was preparation. He had trained himself to fly by instruments alone, to keep calm when the world outside turned to static and noise. Because the goal wasn't to survive the storm. It was to measure it. Every second of his flight would be recorded by 152 sensors, collecting over 9,000 data points per minute, the most complex atmospheric test ever attempted without automation. If he made it back, that data could save lives. If he didn't, his last moments would still teach something. That was the grim math of testing. Every death advanced the science by a paragraph. Champine had no illusions. Before takeoff, he told his crew chief, "If this works, we rewrite the manuals. If it doesn't, bury me with the film reels." The crew laughed nervously. But he wasn't joking. Because in 1946, aviation safety wasn't built in factories. It was built in storms. And Bob Champine was about to fly straight into one. April 13th, 1946, Langley Field, Virginia. The air smelled of rain and oil. The humidity pressed against the hangars like a living thing. Above, a wall of cloud rose over the Chesapeake Bay, layered, violent, pulsing with flashes of distant lightning. Most pilots looked at that sky and stayed on the ground. Bob Champine looked at it and saw a laboratory. His Mustang, the NACA modified P-51D, tail number 84973, sat on the tarmac, gleaming wet silver under the stormlight. Its skin shimmered with hundreds of thin wires running along the fuselage and wings. Thermocouples, barometric pickups, and vibration sensors feeding into a magnetic recorder mounted behind the seat. The technicians had been calibrating for hours. The flight sheet listed 152 sensors and 11 recording channels. They'd tested the wiring twice. They couldn't test the pilot. Champine stood beside the wing, flight suit zipped to the neck, checklist rolled in one hand. He was calm, too calm. One ground crewman muttered, "That guy's nerves are made of stainless steel." But inside, Champine's thoughts were all calculation. Engine temperature, pressure ratios, mixture settings, structural stress under moisture load. He could see the equations in his head. He wasn't trying to prove courage. He was trying to prove predictability. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and began his pre-start ritual like a prayer. Battery, fuel, ignition, prop pitch, throttle cracked, primer pump. The Merlin engine coughed once, twice, then caught. The sound filled the valley, smooth and even. Through his headset, the tower voice came. Langley Control to NACA 242. Thunderstorm activity northwest, severe turbulence. Recommend abort. Champine pressed the mic switch. Negative Control, this is the test. A pause, then, Godspeed, Bob. He eased the throttle forward. The Mustang rolled down the runway, tail rising, propeller biting into humid air. Water streaked off the wings. As the storm swallowed the sun, he rotated and climbed. At 4,000 feet, the first raindrops hit like pebbles. The noise on the canopy was deafening. At 8,000, the world outside turned gray, then black. Inside, the cockpit lights glowed faint red. The instruments quivered. The magnetic tape began recording. Entering precipitation, he muttered into the mic. RPM 2,700. Manifold pressure steady. Airspeed 210. The turbulence hit like a fist. The plane dropped 100 feet in a second, then shot upward. His shoulder harness bit into his ribs. The stick vibrated violently. The altimeter spun like a roulette wheel. He focused on the engine gauge, the one thing that mattered. The Merlin coughed once, then stabilized. Carburetor temp dropped fast, 40 degree, 35 degree, 30 degree, icing range. Mixture rich, anti-ice on, he reported through clenched teeth. Rain density increasing. Lightning flashed so close it painted the cockpit in blue-white light. For an instant he could see the inside of the cloud. Walls of vapor twisting around him, alive, boiling. The radio crackled. Ground control. NACA 242, say position. Static. He keyed the mic, but the words dissolved in interference. The storm was swallowing his signal. Still recording, he said anyway, knowing no one could hear him. The G-forces built like waves. The Mustang bucked, wings flexing, rivets screaming. Rain turned to hail. The vibration meter spiked. 3.2 G, 4.7 G, 5.0 G. The artificial horizon flipped twice before stabilizing. He adjusted trim, throttled back, then pushed the nose up to regain altitude. The engine hesitated. A brief gasp like a heartbeat skipped. For a moment he thought it was over. Then the manifold pressure climbed again. The engine roared back to life. Confirmed recovery, he said, breathing hard. Carburetor heat, maintaining flow. He had done the impossible, kept the engine alive in a place no engine was supposed to run. For the next 8 minutes, he stayed inside the thunderhead. Temperature, pressure, and airspeed surged and dropped like a roller coaster. The plane felt weightless one second, crushed the next. Lightning struck nearby. Static arced across his gauges. He smelled ozone and burning dust. Still, he kept the wings level. Still, he kept flying. The Mustang was bleeding energy. Rain adding drag, power output down almost 20%. But the engine didn't stall. It kept breathing. Champine grinned through the sweat. "She's holding together," he said softly. He made one slow, banking turn inside the cloud, testing lateral stability. The turbulence nearly flipped him upside down. He fought the stick, muscles screaming, forcing the aircraft back on course. "Enough," he told himself. "We've got what we came for." He nosed down, pushing through the wall of rain. The cloud tore apart around him, sunlight bursting through. Below, the Chesapeake shimmered like steel. The storm was still roaring above him, but he was out, alive, instruments still running, film still recording. He keyed the mic. "Langley, this is NACA 242, data secure, request landing clearance." The tower broke into shouts. The controllers had already written him off as dead. "Roger, 242, came the reply. "Cleared for immediate landing. Welcome back, you lunatic." 20 minutes later, his Mustang touched down, skidding slightly on the wet runway. Ground crew rushed forward. The aircraft was soaked, dented, pitted, but intact. Champine climbed out, drenched in sweat, holding the flight recorder under one arm like a relic. One mechanic whispered, "What did you see up there?" Champine smiled faintly. "The truth," he said. "It's wetter than I expected." That flight would become one of the most legendary in NACA's quiet history. The first deliberate penetration of a thunderstorm by a piston-engine aircraft, and the test that would change how engines were built forever. But for Champine, it wasn't legend. It was logic. And in that storm, logic had survived the impossible. When the Mustang rolled to a stop and the canopy popped open, the hangar crew saw the truth written across the metal. The airframe was streaked with scorch marks. The wingtips were pitted from hail. The propeller edges looked sand-blasted. Every inch of the plane told the same story. The sky had tried to kill it. But the engine was still running. Champine sat in the cockpit for a full minute before moving. He listened to the idle hum of the Merlin, the sound of order emerging from chaos, then shut it down and climbed out, exhausted, but alive. His crew didn't cheer, they just stared. Then someone said quietly, "You made it." Champine replied, "So did she." He handed the flight recorder to a NACA engineer, a metal canister filled with magnetic film and pulse traces. "Get that processed," he said. "It's the only reason we did this." The data took 2 days to analyze. When the engineers unspooled the tape and read the oscillograph lines, the numbers hit like artillery. During the storm, the carburetor temperature had plunged to 29 degrees, well below freezing, yet no icing stall occurred. The new de-icing airflow channels held. Fuel-air ratios fluctuated by plus 18%, but combustion remained continuous. Manifold pressure spiked twice to 62 inches, far beyond safe limits, and the engine survived. It shouldn't have. By every previous standard, that power plant should have drowned in its own intake. Champine's flight had proven something nobody had believed, that the new high-altitude carburetor modifications, the so-called anti-icing Venturi redesign, actually worked in real weather. The storm had tried to tear the data apart. The data had won. One engineer at Langley stared at the film for hours. "You mean the engine didn't quit?" Champine just nodded. "Not once." The silence that followed was heavier than applause. It was the sound of science winning a war no one had declared. The readings showed that moisture ingestion, long considered fatal to piston engines, was survivable if airflow was managed properly. That single fact would rewrite maintenance manuals worldwide. The data also revealed a terrifying new insight. Turbulence could induce airflow reversals inside carburetor throats, literal backflow. But the Merlin's intake geometry allowed it to self-correct. The mechanism wasn't perfect, but it explained how pilots could survive brief power losses. For NACA, this was gold. For Champine, it was vindication. He'd risked his life to prove that fear could be measured. And now the math agreed. The official report, labeled NACA Research Memorandum 3A-146, summarized it coldly. Engine function maintained under severe convective precipitation. No catastrophic interruption observed. But between those sterile lines was the real message. The line between theory and death had just moved. The data rippled through the aviation world. Pratt and Whitney and Allison engineers visited Langley to see the results. The Royal Air Force requested copies. American Airlines quietly adopted carburetor heating recommendations derived from the test. For every future pilot who would fly through heavy weather without losing power, that moment traced back to this: one man and one plane inside one storm. But not everyone celebrated. At Wright Field, some officers bristled. They called the experiment reckless, non-standard, even irresponsible. They argued that if Champine had died, it would have discredited NACA entirely. Champine's supervisor, John Stack, replied bluntly, "He didn't die. The data is clean. We'll build from it." The Air Force grudgingly accepted the findings, but only after seeing what came next. The next 3 NACA flights, using the same storm-tested carburetor, reported 0 flameouts in conditions that had previously been lethal. Engine stall incidents dropped by 40% in less than a year. Those weren't opinions. They were numbers. The math of destruction had finally been rewritten as the math of survival. Still, for Champine, the memory of the storm lingered. He could still feel the weight of the turbulence, the flicker of the instruments, the raw sensation of flying through something alive and hostile. When a young engineer asked him afterward, "Were you scared?" He smiled. "Of course I was scared. Fear's the reason the math matters." That was his quiet philosophy. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to log data through it. That single flight transformed how test pilots thought about limits. It wasn't about defiance anymore, it was about discipline under chaos. After the report was filed, NACA ordered the aircraft stripped and inspected. Every rivet was checked, every sensor recalibrated. The Mustang's wings were found to be slightly warped from stress. The propeller hub had microfractures from lightning shock. They asked if he wanted to retire the airframe. Champine said no, she's earned another mission. And so they repaired it. The same Mustang that had entered a thunderstorm was assigned to a new test, high-altitude fuel flow under icing conditions, because now it was the most trusted test platform at Langley. In one act of madness, Champine had taken an airplane designed for war and turned it into an instrument of peace, a flying laboratory for survival. He didn't care about fame. He cared about precision. His logbook entry that day was only 6 words: severe turbulence, data recorded, engine held. But those 6 words marked the moment aviation safety grew up. Because from that storm forward, no engineer ever said again, "We can't test that." The storm had already answered, and the answer was yes, if you have the nerve to fly straight into the problem. Langley Field, late summer 1946. The lab smelled like hot ink and metal dust. Rows of oscillographs chattered, spitting out waveforms. Thin black lines on endless white paper, the pulse of an airplane that had survived the impossible. The engineers clustered around the printouts like doctors studying a patient's heartbeat. The patterns were chaotic at first, then strangely beautiful. Spikes, drops, and recoveries that told a story only they could read. This was not just a flight record. It was a translation, chaos rendered into mathematics. For NACA, this was the moment the storm turned into numbers. Bob Champine sat quietly on a stool, coffee in hand, watching as the data crew worked. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His flight had spoken for him. The chief analyst, a wiry man named Ed Polhamus, ran his finger along the trace of manifold pressure. 22 spikes, he murmured, and it never flatlined. That's impossible. Champine smiled faintly. Not impossible, just measured. The official report took weeks to write. When it was finally published, it was titled simply, "Effect of Atmospheric Turbulence and Precipitation on Engine Operation." It didn't mention thunderclouds, lightning, or near death. It didn't even name the pilot. But inside its 40 pages were numbers that would quietly change the course of aviation. The data proved 3 revolutionary truths. Carburetor icing could occur at 68 degrees. The test showed ice formation in warm, humid air, not just cold weather. This destroyed a decade of assumptions and led to the development of automatic carburetor heating systems. Power loss did not mean stall. Pilots had been taught to panic when engines coughed. The storm flight proved that rough running was recoverable. That single discovery rewrote emergency procedure manuals worldwide. Engine endurance was a function of mixture control, not luck. The Merlin's ability to stay alive through airflow reversals revealed that with the right tuning, even violent weather could be survivable. In other words, pilots weren't dying because of weakness. They were dying because no one had given them the data. The storm had fixed that. Within a year, the U.S. Air Force incorporated NACA's findings into new pilot training materials. The phrase, "pilot error," began to vanish from crash reports. It was replaced with power interruption, due to environmental variables. That change in language was more than bureaucratic. It was moral. Champine's flight had exonerated thousands of dead pilots who had been blamed for their own mechanical betrayals, and it had given the living something priceless, a margin. By 1947, aircraft fitted with the new carburetor Venturi design saw stall incidents drop by nearly 40%. The results were immediate. Commercial aviation adopted the modifications too. The Douglas DC-6 Boeing Stratocruiser and Lockheed Constellation all used improved fuel-air systems directly influenced by NACA's research. Behind every one of those aircraft, in 1,000 quiet takeoffs through bad weather, lived a ghost, a memory of a P-51 flying blind through lightning, proving that the math could hold. Champine's storm flight wasn't classified, but it wasn't celebrated either. NACA didn't do hero worship. It did results. When journalists asked for an interview, he refused. The storm was the star, he said. But within the tight circle of test pilots and engineers, the story spread like folklore. They called him the man who calibrated the clouds. His colleagues started referring to particularly violent turbulence as Champine weather. When new pilots arrived at Langley, they'd hear the story in whispers how one man had flown into the black wall and come back with equations. It became a kind of initiation myth, the line between caution and courage. Meanwhile, the data kept rippling outward. NACA used it to develop de-icing ducts, vapor separation systems, and the first primitive auto-mixture controls. The findings also informed the Air Force's early jet fuel studies, especially concerning flame stability under rain ingestion. The irony was beautiful. Champine's thunderstorm flight, meant to test a piston engine, ended up helping design the world's first jet engines. That's how science works. Chaos at one altitude becomes order at another. And through it all, Champine remained unchanged. He still showed up early, logged his own maintenance notes, and flew test missions no one else wanted. One engineer once asked him, "Why do you keep doing this? You've already proven your point." He smiled and said, "Because the next point hasn't been proven yet." That was the essence of post-war aviation, the relentless hunger to turn terror into truth. The math didn't stop with storms. Soon, NACA would start pushing the limits of temperature, speed, and sound itself, and the pilots who followed, Yeager, Crossfield, Armstrong, would all fly with Champine's data printed quietly inside their manuals. Every safe landing in rough weather, every storm survived by a transport plane, every airliner that kept flying when the sky turned black, all of it traced back to that one flight. A man, a machine, and a storm that refused to be theoretical. Bob Champine didn't become a legend because he was fearless. He became one because he refused to leave fear unmeasured. He had done what no textbook could. He gave flight a margin of forgiveness. And that changed everything. By 1947, the age of propellers was dying, and the jet age was roaring to life. Langley's hangars filled with strange new shapes. Stubby jets, swept wings, prototypes that looked more like bullets than airplanes. The names changed, the engines changed, but the math didn't. And wherever there was risk, Bob Champine was there first. He went from flying into thunderstorms to flying at the edge of Mach 1. His P-51 was replaced by experimental jets. The P-80 Shooting Star, the XP-86 Sabre, and early X-plane prototypes that looked like science fiction made of aluminum. But the habits he learned in the storm never left him. Before every flight, he still walked around the aircraft in silence, touching the metal, checking seams, feeling for vibration through his fingertips. He didn't trust theory. He trusted feedback, data you could feel. He told younger pilots, "You can't sense stability until you've felt chaos." His colleagues respected him because he was fearless in logic, not in ego. They remembered what he'd said after his storm flight, that fear was part of the measurement. The NACA brass began calling him for every mission no one else wanted. Engine ingestion tests, flame stability trials, transonic buffet experiments, each one pushing physics past its comfort zone. In late 1947, he was assigned to fly a P-80 jet into simulated icing conditions, a kind of modern echo of his thunderstorm run. The engineers had developed a new pitot tube heating system, and they needed to prove it could survive rain, ice, and electrical discharge. When asked if he was willing, Champine said, "I already flew inside a lightning bolt once. What's a little ice?" At altitude, the jet shook violently. Icing crept across the wings in seconds. The airflow sensors froze, giving false readings. He stayed on instruments, nursing the engine like a doctor keeping a dying patient alive. The mission succeeded, barely. The new system worked. Another quiet step forward. A pattern was forming. Whenever the research hit a wall of uncertainty, Champine flew through it. He became known among engineers as the feedback loop. He didn't just collect data, he interpreted it mid-air. When instruments failed, he described sensations, buffeting frequency, vibration, control stiffness. And engineers later found his seat-of-the-pants estimates were within 2% of instrument readings. He had become the perfect bridge between machine and math. As jet research accelerated, Champine found himself at the center of the transformation. NACA's storm data evolved into jet engine airflow modeling, the same principles he'd tested in clouds now used to analyze compressor stalls. A decade earlier, he'd fought water ingestion in a piston engine. Now he was studying air ingestion instability and axial flow turbines. Different engine, same problem. Nature still testing the limits of design. One day in 1948, he met a young pilot at Edwards Air Force Base, Charles Chuck Yeager. Yeager had just broken the sound barrier in the X-1. Champine congratulated him quietly, then said, "You flew through shock waves." "I flew through thunder. We both found out fear has a frequency." Yeager laughed and called him the storm guy. They understood each other immediately, men who turned terror into test results. By 1949, Champine's storm data had found its way into jet-age protocols. His findings on turbulence response directly influenced compressor stall suppression systems and jet fuel atomization research. He'd flown a piston engine into chaos, and now the entire jet era was borrowing his math. At Langley, a new generation of engineers arrived, young, ambitious, armed with slide rules and dreams of spaceflight. They studied his reports like scripture. The phrase NACA 242 thunderstorm test appeared in technical references for 2 decades. To them, Champine wasn't a daredevil. He was the first pilot who treated fear as data. In 1950, when NACA began its transition toward high-speed flight research, Champine helped design procedures for the X-plane program. He introduced one revolutionary rule. Every dangerous variable must be measured before it becomes a myth. That single line shaped the culture of test piloting. It turned courage into a science. But Champine himself never sought fame. He refused invitations to air shows. He rarely spoke in public. He considered flying a form of conversation between man and machine, private, disciplined, sacred. When reporters once asked him what it felt like to face a thunderstorm in a fighter, he said only, "It felt like asking God a question and getting a number back." By the early 1950s, jet research had outgrown piston engines, but the lessons of that old P-51 still powered every mission. In the records, you can trace the evolution, from carburetors to compressors, from rain ingestion to airflow resonance. The vocabulary changed, but the principle remained. Control the mixture, respect the medium, measure the chaos. That was Champine's quiet revolution. He didn't invent technology, he invented method. A system of thinking that made the jet age survivable. Without it, there would have been no X-1, no Sabre, no space program. The man who once flew into a thunderstorm to test an engine had unknowingly written the prelude to the supersonic era. In the skies above Virginia, the air still remembered him, the storm pilot who taught aviation how to learn from pain. Every time a modern test jet breaks through turbulence, its flight computers compensating automatically, the data traces still whisper his legacy. Survival isn't luck. It's calibration. And for Bob Champine, calibration was the only form of courage that ever mattered. In the years after that flight, when colleagues called him the craziest man NACA ever hired, Bob Champine only smiled. He'd learned something that statistics could never capture, that there is a kind of reason hidden inside what looks like madness. The logic of his storm flight wasn't about adrenaline or bravery. It was about precision. It was about proving that the line between destruction and endurance could be calculated, that chaos wasn't the enemy of science, but its final exam. Every crash report before 1946 had ended the same way: cause, unknown, probable pilot error. After Champine, that sentence began to vanish. His data showed that failure wasn't random. It was measurable, predictable, and therefore fixable. The crazy pilot had turned myth into math. The transformation rippled through aviation like a quiet revolution. Airlines changed how they trained their crews to handle engine roughness. Manufacturers redesigned fuel delivery systems. Military engineers began treating weather not as an obstacle, but as a variable. In technical terms, Champine had expanded the flight envelope of human understanding. In human terms, he'd taught an entire generation that fear could be engineered out of the equation. When asked years later how he'd stayed calm while flying through lightning, he said, "You don't fight the storm, you observe it." That one sentence summed up his philosophy. Not just for flying, but for progress itself. The logic of his madness lay in this belief: that courage without measurement is waste. But measurement without courage is paralysis. Both were required to move civilization forward. What the world saw as recklessness was actually the purest form of scientific discipline. The refusal to stop asking questions when the answers get dangerous. That's why engineers worshipped him quietly. He was proof that the human mind could match the violence of nature not with strength, but with curiosity. In the years that followed, the cockpit he'd flown through the storm, that battered NACA P-51D, became a test bed for more than just airflow. It became a shrine. The mechanics refused to strip the paint scars off the leading edge, calling them lightning tattoos. They knew they were looking at the exact point where courage met calculation. In technical debriefs, Champine wrote notes so spare they bordered on poetry. Turbulence constant but periodic. Fear manageable when quantified. Data valid. Repeat recommended. Repeat recommended. That was the kind of sentence that built the jet age. The engineers who read it realized something profound. Madness, when properly measured, becomes method. The psychology of flight testing changed because of him. NACA stopped hiring daredevils and started hiring thinkers who were calm under pressure. Men and women who saw danger not as a thrill, but as a variable to be mapped. That culture became NASA. And when NASA's test pilots later rode rockets, they carried the same mindset. Panic doesn't save you. Procedures do. Fear isn't the enemy. Ignorance is. Every spacecraft checklist, every redundant system, every automatic failsafe had its philosophical root in that thunderstorm over Virginia. The lesson wasn't glamorous, but it was eternal. The laws of physics don't care if you're brave, only if you're prepared. In the archives at Langley, a note from a 1952 NACA conference still survives, written in the margin of a report on jet flameouts. Champine's storm flight remains our model for controlled exposure to risk. Controlled exposure to risk, the phrase that defined the space age. Bob Champine never called himself a pioneer. He called himself a mechanic with a notebook. But his notebook reshaped the relationship between man and machine. He died in 2003 at the age of 86. By then, the world had forgotten his name, but not his math. Every modern aircraft, from Boeing to Lockheed to Airbus, carries systems built on principles proven by his data. Stall recovery, anti-icing automation, moisture-resistant ignition. He never flew for fame. He flew so that no one else would have to face death in the dark without numbers to light the way. The storm he entered was never truly left behind. It lives in every takeoff checklist, every engine startup, every weather briefing where pilots see danger and trust their instruments instead of fear. That is the logic of madness, to risk everything so that others won't have to. He didn't end the war against weather. He just gave humanity its first weapon that worked: knowledge. And when he stepped out of that P-51 in the rain, soaked, shaking, and smiling, he had already changed the future of flight. Because madness isn't flying into a storm. Madness is refusing to ask what's inside it. By the time Bob Champine retired from flight testing, the world he'd risked his life to build had outgrown propellers. The sound of the Merlin engine gave way to the shriek of jet turbines, then to the thunder of rockets. But behind all that progress, in every layer of the atmosphere humanity conquered, his fingerprints were still there. Invisible, mathematical, essential. The discipline he'd created at NACA, controlled exposure to risk, became the foundation of the jet and space programs. It was passed down from storm chaser to supersonic pioneer, from cockpit to capsule. Every test pilot who took off into the unknown carried a piece of his logic with them. Yeager breaking the sound barrier, Crossfield flying the X-15, Armstrong stepping onto the moon. Different machines, same philosophy. Measure fear. Don't deny it. Translate it into procedure. That was Champine's real invention. Not a carburetor or a gauge, but a mindset. His storm flight proved something that remains true today. Safety isn't the absence of danger. It's the mastery of it. That's why modern pilots flying through squall lines at 35,000 feet trust that their engines will keep breathing. Their wings flex, the radar paints the turbulence, and the instruments whisper calm truth. They may never know the name Champine, but they live inside his legacy every time their aircraft shrugs off weather that once killed. Because 70 years ago, one man looked at a thunderstorm and saw not death, but data. The logic of that act, madness turned into mathematics, is the logic that took us from the clouds to the stars. In an age when machines are guided by computers and pilots fly by algorithms, the lesson still holds. Courage is the first step in every equation that leads to progress. So the next time lightning flashes against your airplane window, remember this. Someone once flew straight into that light just to prove it could be done safely. The world called him crazy. History calls him necessary.